something like a project proposal is never a solo activity, so please feel free. I told this to my own advisees, but I know all of your mentors are willing to give you feedback on different components as you go, so think about that and try to get yours done in time so that you can get some review from them. But today, I'm going to talk about project communication, and I think that this is incredibly critical, and I'll show you a case study to illustrate why this is so critical for having an effective and successful project. But when you think about what could go wrong, when you think about the contingencies that might happen, one of the biggest contingencies is not communicating effectively. Either not actually giving the messages to the people that need to get the messages at the right time, or speaking in a way or communicating in a way that that audience just can't hear you. That it's not the way that they receive information, it doesn't coincide with their culture or what they do. So you really want to think carefully about how you're planning to communicate. And I'm going to start off with a case study to illustrate. I feel like today is the day of illustrations of what can go wrong. But I will illustrate some things that went right and some things that went wrong with my PhD research and how that might be illustrative of why you want to think about a communication plan. I also want to talk a little bit about some categories of stakeholders that I find really important to think about when I'm starting a new project. It isn't just like you're a stakeholder or you're not, but what kind of a stakeholder are you? Why are you interested in the project? What do you expect to get out of it? Some key lessons learned for me in terms of the project that I was a part of. And then probably about 75% of this session is going to be you guys working on your computers. So you're going to have a lot of time to get stuff on paper about communication and how you want to do your communication plan. I think if you're focused, I think you could actually have a rough draft of your communication plan by the end of this session. So try to focus in, but I want to look at the who, what, when, and how of communication for your project, and then you'll have time to write. So I'll start off with a very, I think that all of us are kind of attracted to these complex, challenging, we're trying to do active applied research, and so when you do that, you're attracted to these complex, challenging, multi-dimensional, multi-stakeholder types of environments. And that's just, what happens when you're trying to solve an environmental problem. However, when you get into that situation, and if you don't have a good plan about how to address all the communication needs that are going to arise, something will go wrong. Some ball will be dropped. And so to think proactively ahead of time is a really good thing to do. So I was attracted to, this green box is the Denali National Park and Preserve. It's kind of in the middle of Alaska. And I was attracted to this area because I was really interested in this wild mix of local people that are making observations on this landscape. This is a vast remote area, so this picture from a plane kind of just gives you an idea of mountains beyond mountains beyond mountains. It just keeps going and going, and there's a lot of land and there's a lot of stuff going on out there. And when you're thinking about how is climate change going to affect a place like this, wow, so many things that could be going on. But who is out there making observations? Who knows what's happening on that landscape? And so I was really interested in kind of casting this wide net and understanding what are trappers seeing, what are subsistence people seeing, what are pilots seeing, what are mountain guides seeing, these people who have like 30 plus years of experience, what are these people seeing about climate change impacts? And it's a really diverse and heterogeneous group of people. So I worked in Nikolai and Lake Minchumina, which are two off-the-road communities. You have to fly in to get there. And then I worked in Talkeetna, Cantwell, McKinley Village, and Healy, which are all along the road system. So I had indigenous people, I had non-indigenous people, I had people that ran recreation businesses, subsistence folks, this huge diverse group of folks, and I had to talk to all of them and communicate with all of them effectively, get them engaged in the project, and also understand how to communicate the project results back to those people. So just to kind of set the stage. So I want to talk a little bit about the different types of stakeholders that were involved in this project. The Subsistence Resource Commission is this really interesting group that the Park Service sets up, and basically it's a group of subsistence folks that are interested in informing park policy about how subsistence should be managed within the preserve boundaries. So in Alaska, it's kind of different than here. Here, national parks are kind of preserved, protected. You know, a lot of uses aren't allowed. In Alaska, those preserve areas are open to a lot of different types of uses, so subsistence is allowed there. And this commission was really set up to say, how are we gonna regulate this? But with climate change, the head of the Subsistence Resource Commission had said, the park has no idea what's happening out there on the ground. They just don't know. And we need to get to talk to the indigenous folks, to the subsistence, to the trappers, to the pilots, and we need to really get a good sense of what's happening out there on the landscape. So interestingly, he was saying this at about the same time that I was telling my advisor, I'd really like to go out and interview people about what they're observing about climate change. So it just like worked out. But they're a governing body, and when you think also about your project, you want to think about the different levels of institutions and governance regimes that are sort of, you know, you might be working with a county, you might be working with a city. For me, I was working with the Subsistence Resource Commission, the Park Service, tribal councils, my PhD advisors. And I can't say enough about how you, as Brian said many times this morning, you are the leader of your project. And as the leader of your project, you need to think about what works for you in terms of communication with all of these stakeholders, but with your advisors, with your mentors as well. How do you want to communicate? How do you want them to communicate with you? When do you want that communication to happen? And just looking at this list, I mean, these are just people that were, you know, in some way interested in the outcomes of their research. So tribal councils in Alaska, each tribe has a tribal council, and they basically are the entity that approves or disapproves of any research that's happening in their community. And so I had to go through them, and I'll talk about this a little bit more later, but they're a type of gatekeeper. And for your project, I really want you to spend some time contemplating who are the gatekeepers for your project. These are the people that can open doors for you, or they can close doors for you. They are really critical to have on your side and to communicate with effectively, because they can also put you in touch with other folks. But even in this short list, all of these people have different goals. They have different visions for what the project is. They have different demands on me. So the Subsistence Resource Commission really wanted me to come up with practical, tangible, we should move the moose hunting from this date to this date. We should expand the duration of when people can go out and do caribou harvests, or whatever it is. They wanted me to come up with really particular changes that the Park Service should do. The Park Service was interested in what I was doing mainly from an interpretation angle. I mean, they wanted to know this for the policy too, but they wanted to know, like, how can we design interpretation materials for our park that encompass climate change, and how do we best communicate that, and can we get little audios of different people in different communities talking about climate change impacts. My advisors, of course, they wanted me to have a great project. They wanted me to publish. They wanted me to get done within a certain timeline. They wanted to be co-authors on my publications, so they had some sort of ownership of the project as well. And then the tribal council really wanted to make sure that whatever I was doing would benefit the tribe in some way, or at least that the tribe would be kept informed of what I was doing. They didn't want, they are in Alaska, people are sick and tired, which I think they should be down here as well, with people coming into their community, doing research, extracting the research, doing their own thing. They never hear back from it. They never hear what the results of the research are. And it's a terrible, and Brian's nodding probably because your parents work with a Native American tribe too, and it's a really unfortunate dynamic that researchers often go in and it's like a hit and run, get what you want, get out of there. So the tribal councils, one of the things that they were really clear about is we want this to come back to our community. And then we had the participants, and so like these were kind of all of the folks that had a stake in what I was doing, and then there were, you know, a really diverse group of people that I was actually asking to interview. So Indigenous and non-subsistence community members, recreation-based business owners, bus drivers. I had no idea at first that the Park Service bus drivers would be one of the best observers of change. They're not employed by the Park Service, they're actually contracted out, but many of them have been driving bus for 30 plus years. So there are people that over time, they see the change in where species are located along roads, all sorts of things. And then I was also interested in long-term researchers, so people who are doing ecological, biological research in communities who are out there on a regular basis collecting observations. What did they know? So if you think about this list of people and then think about, all right, how would you communicate with them? Like, it becomes tricky because there are people that you should communicate with at different times in different places, and there are people that you shouldn't communicate with in the same way. So I'm a naive researcher coming from Colorado, never being in Alaska, not really understanding it. And so the Park Service was very kind, and they said, how about we help you host some community meetings to let people know about your research? And I was like, woohoo, okay, we're gonna go out there. And well, at first, actually, to be quite frank, I was a little bit like, what, you don't trust me? Like, I can't go out and talk to the community myself. Like, I'm a decent human being and I'm not gonna do anything stupid. And so at first I felt like a little bit micromanaged. But then I realized that the Park Service was doing me this great service because I had this idea. I was like, I'm gonna go out, I'm gonna have like fact sheets about my project, maybe I'll put together a PowerPoint, like I'll go in there, I'll present it, like I'm imagining, you know, I don't know why I was imagining this. I was imagining a tribal council sitting in a room like this with me with a project. I mean, it was ridiculous. And that's just, it's not the way it works. And so the Park Service was this great, in a way, both gatekeeper, but also informant about how to best communicate with that population. So what ended up happening is we were crammed in this one little house in Nikolai, and there weren't seats enough for everyone, so half of the people were sitting on the floor, and we're all in a little circle, and there were no materials that I gave out. I just talked for probably 10 minutes about this is what I want to do, and then I probably listened to them for about 45 minutes. But I would have taken the entirely wrong approach if I hadn't had those contacts. So be careful when you're starting your project just to know who do you ask about how to approach different populations and what can they give you, how can they inform you. For me as well, the Park Service, the woman specifically who went with me to the communities was very well respected by the communities, so she also was kind of like a liaison for me. So think about that when you're working with different kind of stakeholder groups. Who could be your liaison? Is there someone that's already respected in that community that could go with you maybe for the first time or make introductions? So the lessons that I learned from my case study, first, to really listen at the beginning. And I think Dominique, you had a great point the other day about like how long. You can't listen forever. And you won't meet everyone's goals and expectations. But at the very beginning of your project, feel free to take the time. Like, don't rush. Spend a little time just listening to people and understanding what they're looking for and what their objectives are. And then I also found out, like, I would listen, but then I would also reflect back to people, what I hear you saying is this. Is that correct? And then that way you really make sure that you get a good understanding of what people want. Understand who the gatekeepers are in your community. So think strategically about like who controls access, information, resources, connections that I have. Think about those people so that you make sure to really forge connections and relationships with those folks so that the rest of your project can go well. I had a colleague in Alaska who was looking at communities facing coastal erosion in Alaska. And one community in particular that was trying, Newtok, that was trying to move their community, and she got embroiled in a tribal council kind of showdown where there were two leaders that had been leaders at different times for the tribal council, and they completely disagreed. And she took sides with one of them, and it ended up throwing her whole dissertation project off because the other one ended up getting elected. And so there's these politics of like just understanding, you know, sort of the relationships you should develop with different types of people. And also, so oftentimes we just think, well, we know how to communicate, like we communicate all the time, and you write an email or you make a phone call and it's not a big deal. But think through your timeline of communication, because some of these steps take quite a while to actually accomplish. So it's not like, you know, one day you're gonna email or call or send letters out to 57 or 120 or however many people it is. Think about the time that it will really take you set up that communication. And it's not just about the communication itself, but figuring out who you need to be communicating with. And then, as I definitely found out in this case, every stakeholder is going to have their own needs and preferences about the way that they want to be communicated with. I could not email Indigenous subsistence community members in these villages that I was working in Alaska. They didn't have email addresses. If they did have email addresses, they probably wouldn't check them. It just wasn't the way that you were supposed to communicate for that community. And so what they wanted is they wanted me to do a regular call to identified community person, and that community person would relay that information to the rest of the group. And that was the best. They had regular community meetings. That was the best way to do it. So think about your stakeholders and think about the feasibility of the way that you're planning to communicate with them. Do you have email addresses for people? Do you have phone numbers? Can you get them? Just making sure that you've got everything. And you'll find this year will go by so fast. And like before no time, it will be 3 of you up here giving your presentations, and you are gonna get busy. And we all want to do our projects the best that we can, but if you don't plan for the communication in advance, it's the thing that will go out the window. So maybe you'll complete your project, but no one will ever hear about it, or you'll lose a few stakeholders along the way because they felt uninformed about what you were doing. So just plan ahead of time, and then be adaptive, so that if suddenly, you've been planning to send out a mail survey and you realize, wow, this population is not going to actually fill it out and return it to me, be adaptive and think on your feet in that whole contingency plan stuff. I also wanted to talk a little bit about professional communication. I think that we talked about professionalism and etiquette, but I think that there's something to be said for specifically how you communicate about your master's project to people. I'd really, you are the leader of your project, so when you're writing emails, write in complete sentences. Every time that a stakeholder interacts with you, they should think of you as a professional. And I know that we had a candidate for a job that I was glad that John Joyous spoke up, because she didn't write in complete sentences. She didn't use punctuation. She didn't use capital letters. And that's just, it's not professional. And you can get away with it in some contexts, and it's fine when you're doing it with friends and stuff, but just know, when you're talking to community members, make sure that you're doing it professionally. Value and respect people's time, and know, you're gonna have all these different players that you wanna keep informed about your project, and you wanna interact with them, but they all have goals and responsibilities and duties, and they're doing multiple things. So a conversation that's sometimes good to have is, how connected to this project would you like to be? When would you like to receive information about it? Just getting an idea of what is going to value and respect other people's time, because you don't want to squander it. And 2 things that I would say here too, if you're having a meeting with someone, send them an agenda beforehand. Say, this is what I would like to cover in our meeting. Send them any materials that you want them to look at beforehand. Don't expect you to go in with your thing and say, here, what do you think of this? Give them time. I mean, people need time to give you informed feedback. And so if you give them materials in advance, if you set an agenda, really good thing. Another thing that's helpful is if after a meeting, send a reminder email about, this is what we talked about, this is what you said you do, this is what I said I do. One other thing I'd say about that is, do not get frustrated if people don't respond to you right away. People are busy. And if you try an email and you wait 2 weeks and you don't hear anything back, call them. Don't be worried about using multiple types of communication, because people get busy, and it usually isn't because they don't care. It's usually just they're busy. The other thing I'd say is, especially at the beginning of project development, know when to carbon copy people on emails. If you're setting up a meeting, there's a great example, Erin was setting up a meeting with her community sponsor, and she CC'd me, which was awesome, so that we were all in the same loop about when this meeting would take place. And just think about, CCing people can definitely be a power move, someone's watching you, I'm sending you this message, but I'm letting this person watch. But oftentimes at the beginning of project development, it's just about, let's keep everyone on the same page, and you've got to, have some empathy for your advisors. We're all busy people. So if you CC people on those emails, then they're in the loop. And even if they're not looking at it right away, they know kind of what's happening and where things are going. It is a judgment call, and I don't think it's always CC everyone. But just think about, is it going to make things more streamlined and efficient in the future if both of these people know about this now? And we'll work with you if there's something that we feel like, I don't need to be CC'd on those things, we'll work with you, but just consider it when you're sending emails. Thank you notes go a long way. Like, you meet with a stakeholder who's giving you feedback about your project afterwards, say, thanks so much for the time that you spent with me, I really appreciated it. Here's my email address if you ever want to contact me, or whatever it might be. But thank you notes go a long way, and they foster goodwill. It's like putting good karma out into the universe.
You're talking physical.
Physical, and I actually do physical, and that's my style. I think you could do email thank you notes, but I feel like people don't receive mail for the mail very often anymore, and when they receive a thank you note that's handwritten, they're like, oh, this person actually really appreciated that time, and it makes them more willing to give time in the future, or just a more positive feeling about your project in general. I think that all of our projects will do this, but I encourage you to think about really specific ways, like once you're done with your project, how are you going to communicate it to the people that helped you with it? How are you going to communicate it to the stakeholders that were involved? What can you do? Is it a community presentation that you do? Is it a poster that you create for the library in the community that you're working in? Is it a newspaper article that you work to get published? Is it an article in something like High Country News, like Andres and I have been talking about his project, and maybe trying to tailor a more popular piece for High Country News to get the word out more broadly? And then if you do something like that, have a news article, send a copy of it or email a copy of it to the people that helped you along the way, just so that they can see. It's like closing the loop. You start with folks and hopefully you end with folks, and kind of let them know how the project went. And no one is going to have the same goals and needs as you do. And it is it is critically important that you consider your own goals and needs in your project. You don't want to end up trying to do everything for everyone because it's what everyone wants. But at the same point, you don't want to be so focused on, I am doing a master's project and that's all I'm doing, and I need to write this project report and then I need to get a job. You need to have empathy for what other people are trying to get out of your project. And I think most of you do, and that's why you're doing this type of a program and this type of a project, is because you care about the outcome for that community. But just make sure that you really understand what their goals and objectives are, what their timelines are, when they'd like to have things, so that you can really work your project in a way, or, and sometimes, like what Dominique was saying, you're not gonna be able to meet everyone's needs. And so being really transparent early about, I hear that you would like this for my project, it's not gonna happen. I just can't do it in the scope of what my project is. That's fine, but it's worse to sort of just la 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 la, and then at the very end they realize, wow, you haven't done that thing for us that we thought you were gonna do. So, and then types of stakeholders. We talked about gatekeepers, and I tried to brainstorm on here when you might want to include this type of stakeholder in your project. So gatekeepers, like the National Park Service was for me, like the Tribal Council was for me, they were mainly involved in the planning stages when I was trying to get access to that community, and then post-project when I was disseminating the research. So it really wasn't that important to them that I communicated during it. All gatekeepers will probably be different, but just make sure, like, when would you like me to communicate? And usually people like this, they want to help you get it started, they want to hear what you did, they don't really care about the interim. What I call critical allies are people that support your project, people that are excited about your project and are going to help you with what you're doing. They can be short-term people, like the person who is, with the Park Service that's going to come to your forum that you're doing. That's a short-term critical ally. They could also be long-term, and I think that the long-term type is really important to think about. And when I say long-term critical allies, they're people who, through your project, you can build connections that will last for your entire career. So you think about the people who could help you get jobs in the future, who maybe you want to work with in the future. Those are critical allies, and even if they're not directly involved in the project, it might be good to reach out. Like if you know that there's an organization, like Liz Weiss has an organization that she would like to work for, is it Bicycle Colorado?
Yeah.
Yeah, and so just to reach out and be like, hey, I'm doing this project, you know, what's your advice on it? Then send them a thank you note. That's a critical ally that could be a long-term, you know, project supporter or just long-term career supporter. So think about those people. Then there's people that might not be direct participants, but they're beneficiaries. They're people that are going to benefit from the type of research or the type of project that you're doing. And those also often are in the planning stages and in the post-planning. And in the planning stages, it's more like, how could this project benefit you? And in the post-planning is, this is what I've done, is this a benefit, sort of thing. Then there's participants who are the people that you're doing surveys with, interviews, coming to focus groups. Not all of you are doing social science, so this won't apply to all of you. But some of you will have participants, and they are, you know, primarily during the implementation phase. To me, I always feel like post-project, these people should hear about your project. So I always ask, when I involve people in whatever it is, could I have your email address so that when I'm done, I can send you the results of the study? And don't send them your MEM project report, because no one will read that. But think about doing like a fact sheet or a brochure or a one-pager executive summary, something like that, and send it out to everyone. And then there could also be interested stakeholders, people that, you know, they're not participating, they're not really benefiting from it, but they're like, wow, that's kind of cool, and maybe I'll use it. In this category, I think of people, you know, like Andres is doing this project with the Park Service here locally. Well, there might be other Park Service units that might be interested, but not necessarily participants or allies, but, you know, someone that might be able to use what happened. And then the general public, which is just making sure that what you do gets out to people who might have an interest more generally. Can anyone think of anything that I've left out? Because I'm sure I have not captured all types of potential stakeholders. Yeah.
I was just thinking about my reading and consultation list,
Yeah.
and possibly some of the people that I try to strike up relationships with, they might be interested in eventually,
Yeah.
like getting that fact sheet as well, or keeping the lines of communication open once they figure out what's going on.
Yeah, definitely. So that would be more people who kind of help you build or structure your project, or people who can inform what you're doing. So almost like a type of mentor.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I think you just made me think of something too, John, that when you're starting a project, I would start an Excel spreadsheet of everyone that you've talked to about your project and keep it in one place. Like just have name, name. Usually for me these days, unless they're people that I'm sending a thank you note to, I'll do name, email address, phone number, just so you can keep track of who you've talked to about the project. And then when you're done, you're not like, oh, who was that guy that I talked to way back in July, you know? Keep it in one place and just say project contacts, and you can code them in different ways. You know, have a line that says, is this a participant? Is this someone that I talked to? So I don't think that this is, oh yeah, Tyler.
What's kind of the unwritten rule maybe of, in like a scoping process of interviewing people, but very informally just to sort of talk, of recording that for personal use? Is that okay? Do they always have to know that you're doing that? Can you kind of sneak it in on them?
They do have to know. It's always kinder to let them know.
Yeah.
I'm going to use this against you later. No, I know you wouldn't do that, but it's always kinder to let them know. And there's kind of a gray line between what you should get a consent form for and what you shouldn't. If you're planning to use it for any sort of research write-up that you do, you probably should get a consent form. If you're doing a really informal conversation to say, hey, I'm thinking about doing this project, what do you think of it? I don't think that's something that you need a consent form for, but it's kind of a little bit of a gray area, and you just want to be careful. If you're going to end up analyzing that data and then coding it and writing it up into your report, you'll want to get a consent. And I always just say, I can't remember everything, and I don't always take the best of notes, so do you mind me recording this? Most people don't.
does that go for, like, if you're not recording, like audio recording, but maybe you're trying to like take notes pretty thoroughly, is that the same standard?
It's not exactly the same, and it kind of comes down to if you're gonna use that in your project write-up. Like, if you see that as more informing project development, I don't think that you need to get consent form, but if you see that as being actual data that you're gonna use, then you should get consent. Andres, do you have?
Kind of along the same lines, so like on our consultation list, if there's people that we want to interview to get an idea of where our project's going to go forward, but we might also be quoting them as we move forward, do we have to get all that stuff or just sit down and talk to them?
If you're quoting them, it depends. Like, if you're quoting them in a academic research article, you should definitely get their consent ahead of time. If you're gonna quote them in some other context, I would say before you actually use their quote, check back in with them and say, I'm thinking of using this quote, is that okay? Just to make sure. I mean, it's actually a gesture of kindness and not necessarily a requirement to check back in about the quote you're gonna use, but especially if they didn't know that you were asking them those questions to quote them, it's nice to offer that. Yeah.
I also think it's really important to quote accurately and not use it to, use it to inform but not to push your thoughts. Because you can, it's really frustrating when people take your quote and use it in the wrong context and it changes how you.
Or if they, I mean, it's really frustrating. I've had this happen quite a bit where people are just taking notes and they're taking shorthand notes about what I'm saying, and they'll quote me wrong, and most of the words in the sentence are right, but like the intention of it is wrong. And so, you know, if you want to quote people in the future, using an audio recorder is nice, because then if they ever come back and say, that's not what I said, you have it on tape so that you know, like, actually, you know, I can send you that audio file, you know, but if you're planning to use it in that way, probably a consent form would be good, just so that the person knows that that's something that you're intending to do with them.
And what's the difference between a consent form and going through the IRB process, or is that where that comes from?
It's where it comes from, and they have sample templates about the IRB, and we'll go into that in more depth. I really am guessing that most of you will be exempt, which means that it's a really pretty streamlined process, but there is a training that you have to go through. You do have to formally submit your paperwork, and you have to kind of plan ahead. But it's actually great for research practice to do that pre-planning. So, anything else about other types of stakeholders? One that, you know, when you're thinking about your contingencies, one that I didn't put up here, but you might want to think about is there anyone that is going to hate your project? Is there anyone that is going to be offended by your project or try to stop your project? Or, and I mean, that's not necessarily, like, you don't necessarily have to communicate with those people unless you really want to, but to think about what could go wrong, like who are the people that could come out against what you're trying to do, and thinking through that and that sense of contingency is pretty important. Okay. So we're going to start an exercise and check what time it is. Okay. So what we're going to do is I just want you to take 5 minutes, so you're not going to have very much time, but just in a Word document on your computer. I think that would be easier, but you can use a notebook if you need to use a notebook. Just list who are all the stakeholders. Try to be as comprehensive as possible, you know, and think about those different categories that we thought about: gatekeepers, critical allies,